the big storm on the horizon, 2025. We're going to go through a time warp. You're going to see radical disorder in the next 5 years. First, I should explain that experience I had of learning that many of the things that surprised me because they didn't happen in my lifetime before, but they happened many times in history. The first time I was clerking on the floor of the New York Stock Exchange in 1971, and the United States, Nixon defaulted on the promise to deliver gold for money because they didn't have enough money, real money, gold, and it went down. I went on the floor of the New York Stock Exchange expecting a big down. It went up a lot. That's because I never had a devaluation. If it happened that, I found that in March 1933, the exact same thing happened with Roosevelt on the radio, same thing. Then I studied the 30s, what happened in 1938 in terms of the depression leading to the wars and so on, and the interest rates hitting zero is the exact same thing that happened in 2008. It was because I studied that we were able to make a lot of money in the 2008 financial crisis. So 3 things started to happen in my lifetime, our lifetimes, that never happened before. And I needed, therefore, to study them in history. The first is the amount of debt and money creation. Huge amounts of debt and money creation. Does that matter? What is the rise and decline of a reserve currency? How does that all work? I needed to see the cycles for that. The second was the amount of internal political conflict, in particular populism of the left and populism of the right. And a populist is a person who will not accept losing. They fight with their contingency, and that dysfunction and that lack of willingness to lose, and there's a dynamic that we're going on for that. And the third, of course, is the great power conflict. In other words, the rise of a comparable economic and military power in the form of China rising and competing with the United States, which is also changing that world order. Those 3 things never happened in my lifetime, but are big things that are affecting things. When I went back in history, I said I needed to study how these things work. Sometimes we overlook the really big things. So I went back and I studied that, and I saw that there were 2 others that had enormous impact. The 2 others were acts of nature, in particular droughts, floods, and pandemics. And they killed more people, and they toppled more empires and changed more world orders than anything. And certainly, big issue. Now, number 5 is technological changes and how they evolve. So I needed to study those 5 forces. I saw that there's the cycle that repeats over for good cause-effect relationships. I don't believe in a cycle just because it repeats. I started to understand the cause-effect relationships.
I studied the 10 most powerful empires of the last 500 years and the last 3 reserve currencies. It took me through the rise and decline of the Dutch Empire and the guilder, the British Empire and the pound, the rise and early decline in the United States Empire and the dollar, and the decline and rise of the Chinese Empire and its currencies, along with their significant conflicts, as measured in this chart. Because looking at all these measures at once can be confusing, I'll focus on the 4 most important ones: the Dutch, British, US, and Chinese. As you can see, they transpired in overlapping cycles that lasted about 250 years, with 10 to 20-year transition periods between them. Typically, these transitions have been periods of great conflict because leading powers don't decline without a fight. In this study, I used 8 metrics: education, inventiveness and technology development, competitiveness in global markets, economic output, share of world trade, military strength, the power of their financial center for capital markets, and the strength of their currency as a reserve currency. Because these powers are measurable, we can see how strong each country is now, was in the past, and whether they're rising or declining. By examining the sequences from many countries, we can see how a typical cycle transpires. Better education typically leads to increased innovation and technology development, and with a lag, the establishment of the currency as a reserve currency. You can also see that these forces then declined in a similar order, reinforcing each other's decline. In a nutshell, the big cycle typically begins after a major conflict, often a war, establishes the new leading power and the new world order. Because no one wants to challenge this power, a period of peace and prosperity typically follows. As people get used to this peace and prosperity, they increasingly bet on it continuing. They borrow money to do that, which eventually leads to a financial bubble. The empire's share of trade grows, and when most transactions are conducted in its currency, it becomes a reserve currency, which leads to even more money. At the same time, this increased prosperity distributes wealth unevenly, so the wealth gap typically grows between the rich haves and the poor have-nots. Eventually, the financial bubble bursts, which leads to the printing of money and increased internal conflict between the rich and the poor, which leads to some form of revolution to redistribute wealth. This can happen peacefully or as a civil war. While the empire struggles with this internal conflict, its power diminishes relative to external rival powers on the rise. When a new rising power gets strong enough to compete with the dominant power that is having domestic breakdowns, external conflicts, most typically wars, take place. Out of these internal and external wars come new winners and losers. Then the winners get together to create the new world order, and the cycle begins again.
I think China's going to be a big power for the foreseeable future. I think the basic picture in China, the United States, the emergence of India, and so on, the world order is going to change in a very profound way. We can't say who's going to be the winner and the loser of this game, but I think we do know that this conflict is going to be with us, and it's totally changing the world order. When you're asking, like, who's going to be the winner of this game, in the history of democracy, as Plato described in the Republic, there's a cycle. And one of the great vulnerabilities of democracies is the disorderliness, the anarchy that comes from a conflict. The risk of capitalism is when you have the wealth gap clash and the opportunity gap clash, and that produces risk for democracy. In the 30s, 4 major democracies, because of that dynamic, their parliaments chose to be autocracies. That happened in Germany, Italy, Spain, and Japan. Both have risks. We've all been blessed with this amazing environment, equal opportunity, the ability to be creative, rule of law, civility. But if we risk those things in both of those, then we have a great risk. On this war, I think it depends more on how we are with our circumstances to be strong and capable and relative to them. It certainly is going to be a test of the systems. Every conclusion that I have is a function of measuring statistics and having them as leading indicators. India has the highest potential growth rate. I think India is where China was when I started to go in 1984. So if you look at the complexion, the per capita income, so that you have a massive reform, development, creativity, all those elements. There are, of course, issues, risk issues, but India is very important. Now, of course, there's a religious internal issue having to do with the population has 240 million Muslims. And I don't think that any of these issues is going to stop India. Also, in history, the countries that were the neutral countries did the best, better than the winners in wars. So as we have this conflict between the United States and China and its allies, Russia, and so on, as we see that line up, countries that are in the middle, like India, are going to be net beneficiaries of that. So there are 2 big epicenters where things are happening fast and quick and getting better. Well, let's say 3. One of them is there's the ASEAN countries. We can say that Singapore essentially is a hub, but the ASEAN countries, which is, Indonesia, Philippines, Vietnam, and all of that, that's going to be a great area. The Middle East, in terms of particularly the Gulf countries, the amount of money, and they're making talent magnets. They're attracting people. You look at how the change in wealth has taken place. That's certainly it. And India. They think there are 2 different systems, 2 different approaches. They would think that an autocratic, they used to have a committee that would make it, but they would say it would be very much like a company. If you had a company, you have a board, you have the executive committee, and so on and so forth, and you make sure you get the leadership. And then they would say that the world should have a competition, and that throughout history, there are these competitions in all the various ways we talk about, and there's an emergence of that, and that there's an inevitability, and I think we say that there's an inevitability for a conflict, because there's a containment, and then there's a desire to expand. And it's like almost keeping a lid on a boiling pot. That's the type of situation. I can go on at length about the particulars of their thing. They have a very good historical perspective because their history has been literally 5,000 years. Like we think of ours. They remember the particulars, and all the leaders study that. And there is a cycle that they're very conscious about. So, for example, the big risk that they believe is instability. Xi says that the big storm on the horizon. He keeps referring to the big storm on the horizon. And that relates to the conflict in the world that we're talking about. But it also relates to the fact that they've got a debt problem. They have a debt restructuring problem. And their instinct through history, the learning of history, is that during such periods of time, internal conflict is a big threat. And therefore, autocracy, strong controls are the things to have. Okay, now we can explore the relative merits of that internal conflict and so on, but that's basically their perspective. Let me first deal with the productivity thing. Throughout history, productivity's been the greatest. And so if you take the 20s, we had the productivity, most inventions, most patents and so on in the 20s. You also had a debt problem, and you also had a wealth gap problem. I believe that in terms of the new technology, we're going to really see new technologies. Now, they can be used for weapons or they can be used for productivity, but we're going to have a reorganization of how are we going to redistribute the wealth and opportunities and so on. So if we come back, I think we just have to look at what are we fighting for now? What's going on? Of course, there's a fight over money. If you have a downturn, if you have a debt problem, and I think there's good reason to believe we will. We can get into that in a minute. But they fight over money, and they fight over differences in values. In other words, the differences in values, like how do you educate your children? What is gender issues and education issues and those types of things? And so I think you're seeing those things to fight over. You're seeing plenty to fight over. And let's say we don't fight. Let's pray we don't fight. We need is to come together. But if, let's say, we don't fight, you're still going to have to deal with how do you redistribute not only money, but how do you redistribute opportunities? And that's going to take figuring it out. And there's going to be an argument over how they do that.
No, I think this is really interesting because I think you're saying if you don't fight over the historic area battlefields, right? If we're not fighting over resources, we are going to fight over social issues or social constructs or social beliefs.
But I'm also saying you're going to fight over resources. Like we have debt. And we'll operate as though it doesn't matter, and we'll continue to have the pile. If you look at history, and we can get into why it is not that goes on a while. And you can't continue to increase your living standards by borrowing more than you're spending. You can't keep accumulating your debt because it has to matter. So these types of things, as they build up, as the debt builds up, as the wealth gaps builds up, the values gaps build up, and then there's difference in reaction to controls. So you see the movement. We will have things to fight over at the same time as we hopefully will have a productivity miracle. I think that in the next 5 years, year by year, we're going to go through a time war. You're going to see radical disorder in the next 5 years as each one of those things comes to pass. First with the elections as we have, then we have the conflict with the geopolitical conflict. Then we have the climate issue, which, by the way, is a very expensive issue. We should talk about how costly that issue is. And then we're going to have this issue of technology, which can provide the greatest miracle, but also is a weapon.
Just frame for us your thoughts on debt for a second. There is a U.S. debt, but then there are also every other 182 countries who have a ton of debt. And so how do you think about debt to GDP relatively and in absolute terms?
For any country, and quite often many countries, because they go through the cycle together, as they did in the 30s, what happens is debt rises relative to incomes. And what that means mechanistically is that debt service payments rise relative to incomes. And so it squeezes out consumption as compounds. What happens is there's a realization that they have to print money. So I think you're going to see in the next downturn another move to print money. There are certain things that are going on now that means that the big risk comes when they don't want to hold those bonds anymore. Okay? Because the supply demand, think about that supply demand. It has a deficit. It has to borrow. And so it sells its bonds. Who are the buyers of the bonds? Why do they buy? The buyers of the bonds buy because there's an attractive return. Not only do you have to sell those amounts of bonds, but when they start to realize that I'm not getting good returns on those bonds, they can sell those bonds. There are $31 trillion of bonds.
What would they own instead?
They always own tangible things, and those things can also be, it could be equities, it could be many other things. It could be gold. Gold has always been accepted as a money because there's a saying, gold is the only asset you can have that, not somebody else's liability. In other words, They're dependent on getting paid. Right. You can have that at intrinsic value, and for a long period of time, it's been valued and you can move it between countries. But also, different countries prosper. So you'll see the countries, some of the countries that we mentioned, they will prosper through that. The United States made most of its money because it didn't enter the war. It was before, on World War II and World War I, the United States became the richest country because of the money it made before it entered the war. So those countries will prosper. And in those countries, then certain real estate will profit, hard assets. But where you have that is very, very important. There's a huge wealth gap, and the nature of our economy is producing this. So I can rattle off a bunch of statistics. What happened, as happens in these cycles, is that when you have the type of situation we have, the government will take on the debt and it'll send out the money. So the mechanics of that were that there was more checks and more money sent than there was loss of income by a lot. So a lot of money went out. And as a result of that, the financial conditions of the household sector improved, generally speaking, while the financial conditions of the government sector, the government got into a lot more debt. That's very classic at the end of the cycle. Because there's an imbalance between demand and purchases of bonds, there is the central bank buying those bonds, that monetization. So now that's what the wealth gap looks like. That also creates more of the inflation. The late 20s in the United States is such a classic example. We had more innovations, more technology, all of these cycles. If I was to go back to the Industrial Revolution, late 1800s, and then you turn, when there's a lot of debt and a big wealth gap, and you have the Panic of 1907, boom, you have this internal conflict, and you had the First World War. In the 20s, you had the same kind of late 20s. It was an era of great inventiveness. The other things matter.
So just because we're really great at innovation isn't going to save us if all these other things are broken.
It's a wonderful thing, but ultimately, we as a society, in aggregate, are spending a lot more money than we're earning. So if we're doing such a good job on that technology, why is that happening? Okay, so now when you look at the debt, do you want to own the debt? Do you want to own that? When those who don't want to own it, then you have a financial problem. And populism, that's a dangerous combination at the same time as you have an external. So it's a very risky, and then also at the same time that's happening, they'll win at all costs. They won't compromise. They will win. They will fight for that side and win. And that everything needs to be reformed. I'm not against capitalism, but it needs to be reformed. And part of the big problem, just analytically, mechanically, is that the profit system alone does not direct resources adequately. Let's say if we take climate, for example. There are costs, terrible costs that come from climate. It's not built into the system. Education. Look at the gaps in education. State government controls education. Then you get to the town, and at the town level, it's the town that controls the education, how much they pay. And so then you create wealth gaps with rich people being able to take care of their kids in a way that other people can't take care of their kids. And that creates an opportunity gap. That's a structural problem. There are pre-existing conditions that represent challenges. So, for example, the amount of debt that we're in, it represents a challenge. There are a lot of these challenges, but it is not inevitable. We're going to have an interesting 2 years. We're going to have an interesting China-U.S. relations. We're going to have an interesting financial conflict, and we're going to have radical technology changes, plus climate's going to be an issue.
In 2008, he sounded the alarm about the impending financial crisis, and now he's warning about something even more important.
Well, there's a supply-demand, When there's a lot of debt, it has to be sold, and there is not enough buyers for that debt. And when that happens, bad things happen, like interest rates go up and the economy goes down. So you got to get that down to about 3% of GDP,
What is
and
it
now
now?
it's six and a half.